My name is Mark LeBel, an associate here at the Regulatory Assistance Project. I'll be joined today by Jim Lazar, a senior advisor at RAP, and Paul Chernick, president at Resource Insight. Today we're here to discuss our new manual on electric cost allocation for a new era. We'll be sticking primarily to higher level principles and concepts today, and we plan to have another webinar on more technical issues. Before we get started, there are a few logistical details. Because there are a large number of attendees, we will keep all of you muted. You can submit questions, however, in the questions box. We will do our best to get to as many questions as we can. The webinar will run for 60 minutes, but we will stay on for an additional half hour if there are more questions. And finally, you should know that this webinar is being recorded. In a few days, we will send you a link to the recording and the slides. Electric Cost Allocation for a New Era is a new publication from RAP. It is a guide to the allocation of electric utility costs between customer classes, but has some bigger implications. You can think of it as a companion volume to an earlier publication, Smart Rate Design for a Smart Future. The most important pieces of this manual are about accounting for the significant changes of the past 30 years and laying out how cost allocation should be reformed going forward. We will touch on the major topics of this manual today: principles and key background, changes in the industry and in regulation that require new methods, overarching issues that are important in all frameworks, some basic issues relating to embedded and marginal cost studies, and key reforms to account for the modern electric system. We will be focusing on embedded cost methods today, how to use the results of cost studies, and finally, key takeaways. We do anticipate doing a more technical webinar in the next few months that will be a deeper dive on a number of topics, including marginal cost studies. The three authors, Jim Lazar, Paul Chernick, and Bill Marcus, have about 130 years of combined experience with utility regulation. They've testified on cost allocation issues in 43 states, plus many federal and local regulatory bodies in the US and Canada. I was privileged to be the editor of the manual. That's me at the bottom, dutifully supporting our authors. At this point, I'd like to hand it over to Paul Chernick to discuss some principles and important background. Paul, take it away.
Thanks, Mark. A typical rate case begins by determining the revenue requirement, the process shown in green at the top of this diagram. It ends with the design of rates, shown at the bottom. In the middle, in blue, is the cost allocation process, which splits the revenue requirement among the classes. That step is the subject of this new manual. So, why did we write this book? Why does cost allocation matter? Well, cost allocation matters because it determines how much each group will pay. Regulators want to find an equitable division of costs among customer classes. So what do we mean by equitable? Equity is usually defined in terms of cost causation, why the costs were incurred, or the distribution of benefits, how customers are using those assets and services. Results of cost studies can inform rate design, although the manual urges caution in that regard. Older techniques and the most current techniques were, most of the current techniques were developed before 1990, have trouble accounting for the features of the modern grid. Let's go back to 1992. The traditional methods for cost allocation were developed using assumptions about how the electricity grid used to work, using the limited data then available. The grid in 1992 consisted almost entirely of centralized generation, transmission to bring that power to load centers, and distribution networks to deliver power to individual customers. We typically had detailed data on generation performance, but data were much more limited for loads at the customer level and along the delivery system. There are two primary types of cost allocation study: embedded cost of service studies, or ECOSS, and marginal cost of service studies, MCOSS. This webinar focuses on the more common ECOSS. In a traditional embedded cost study, the analysis starts with the revenue requirement. The first step is the functionalization of costs, deciding whether each cost category is associated with generation, transmission, distribution, or something else. The traditional second step is classification, determining if these costs are demand-related, energy-related, or customer-related. The final step is allocation among the classes based on different usage and customer metrics. We'll also discuss a more modern framework later today. NARUC issued a cost allocation manual in 1992 that remains a common reference work on allocation methods. This excerpt shows that even in 1992, regulators recognized that some transmission and distribution costs are driven by energy. Unfortunately, most studies since 1992 have ignored energy-related transmission and distribution costs, despite the manual's recommendation. Marginal cost analysis emerged in the late 1970s when new resources were much more expensive than existing resources to make the rate process more forward-looking. The steps for a marginal cost study differ from those of an embedded study. We calculate unit costs for energy by time period, for peaking capacity, and for other T&D elements, and multiply these by measures of the usage by each class. The sum of the marginal costs differs from the revenue requirement, requiring a reconciliation that can distort allocations. Marginal cost is important in guiding rate design, but using it in cost allocation raises practical problems. Our next webinar will address marginal cost methods in more detail. And now Jim will discuss some of the changes to the electric system since the NARUC manual came out.
Thanks, Paul. You know, a lot has changed since 1992. Most of the cost allocation methods now being used predate the 1990s. Many go back to the 1950s. Since then, numerous technology and regulatory changes have occurred. Cost allocation techniques can and should be updated to account for these changes. Conversely, older techniques often have difficulty accounting for these changes. Wind and solar are different from gas and coal. They are capital intensive with almost zero operating costs, but they displace lots of fuel. The peaking or capacity value varies by region and by resource. Storage is also capital intensive. We use it to take excess energy in low cost periods and save it for use in higher cost periods. We can locate storage where we need it, and that way avoid generation, transmission, and distribution costs. It's also very reliable and very fast responding when we need it, much better than any conventional power plant for providing ancillary services. Traditional cost allocation techniques have trouble dealing with a capital investment that has all these different purposes and benefits. Customer-sided generation changes many things, starting with the definition of a customer. That customer may also be a generator. Solar fundamentally changes peak load periods, both for distribution planning and for generation planning. And the distribution system can provide upstream benefits. In Hawaii, now, excess generation from residential areas during the middle of the workday backfeeds onto the transmission grid for usage in commercial buildings elsewhere on the grid. Energy efficiency is a little different. It's implemented on the customer's side of the meter, but it saves generation, transmission, and distribution costs. But for accounting purposes, efficiency costs are often recorded down in account 908 in the customer service group of accounts, not in the power supply or distribution functions. A modern cost study must allocate these costs based on why they are incurred and the benefits they provide. Demand response lets us cut non-essential loads at peak or otherwise critical times to avoid the need for generation, transmission, and distribution investment. In essence, we're substituting data and controls for traditional supply-side capital investments. Once again, traditional cost allocation techniques have trouble dealing with a resource that has benefits span the entire system. Smart grid investments can reduce system costs, optimize system use, and tell us where to locate storage to minimize total costs. These investments, once again, have benefits that span the electric system and should be treated that way in cost allocation studies, regardless of how the costs show up in the accounting system. You also get a lot of new data from smart grid and AMI. We used to sample maybe 400 customers on a system for load research purposes using cassette recorders. Now we can have 100% sample rate with granular interval data that's location specific, circuit by circuit, customer by customer. That opens up new analytical possibilities for cost allocation as well as for system planning. Electric vehicles are a potential very large load. That's mine you see in the picture. They will cause high incremental generation, transmission, and distribution costs if not carefully managed. But recent pilot programs in Minnesota and elsewhere show that over 90% of EV charging will take place during low-cost hours if the costs are correctly conveyed to customers. Today's grid is very different from 1992, and tomorrow's grid will have even more changes. Distributed generation, smart appliances, storage, sensors, and controls are spread throughout the modern grid. More flexible analytical techniques enabled by this data are needed to account for all of this. Regulatory changes since the 1990s are also significant. With restructuring, ISOs, renewable energy credits, sub-hourly markets, we have a lot more to keep track of. Performance-based regulation is reducing the dependence of utilities on capital investments for earning opportunities. This means that the revenue requirement is more divorced from traditional system costs. That raises new questions. And new public policy programs involve investments and expenses that require careful attention in the apportionment of cost in a way that traditional utility assets really did not. And now I'll hand it back to Mark.
Thank you, Jim. The manual goes into detail on some overarching issues that matter regardless of the type of cost study you are using. I'm going to talk about two of those in particular. Cost causation on the electric system is a basic concept regardless of the analytical technique. The real economic justification for each cost may be different from the traditional accounting treatment. First, nearly all of the system serves the joint needs of all customers. All generation, all transmission, and most distribution is sized based on the joint needs of all customers across all hours. The exceptions are some line transformers and most service drops. There are some distinct cost drivers that need to be considered. Energy supply costs, including capital, fuel, variable operating costs, and purchase power costs, are time differentiated by their nature. Transmission lines serve diverse purposes. Traditional purposes include bringing power from remote generating plants and economic exchange between utilities. But today, transmission is used for renewable energy integration and other purposes. Distribution systems are generally built only where there is a market for energy. Lastly, basic meters are used for billing and are not particularly part of the distribution system per se. The costs of AMI are being incurred for a broader array of purposes and not just billing. A key decision is how to divide customer classes. This can be done on the basis of voltage level, customer type, or some measure of the size of the customer. The idea behind customer classes is that different types of customers are responsible for different levels and types of costs. So it is fairer and more efficient to charge the groups different rates. So what you're looking for is to segment customers by significant cost differentials. The picture on the left shows a division by voltage level, treating all secondary voltage customers, both residential and commercial, the same. This is a very clear cost distinction. Secondary customers have line transformers and secondary networks that other customers don't use. Another option is to divide customers by the type of premises. If you go this route, you can consider whether there should be more than one residential class or subclass. Now, Paul and Jim will discuss high-level issues with embedded cost techniques. First, here's Paul.
Thanks, Mark. The manual identifies some fundamental best practices for all kinds of studies. First, all shared assets should be apportioned on some measure of usage. Second, administrative and overhead costs should be shared broadly. Third, dividing costs into fixed and variable buckets doesn't tell us anything about the causes, uses, or benefits of those costs. Fourth, only customer-specific costs are customer-related. The Colorado PUC recently joined several of its peers in finding that customer-classified costs should be based on the basic customer method, only customer-specific costs being included, instead of a minimum system, which includes shared distribution. Some cost of service studies treat a wide variety of electric utility costs as fixed and assume no fixed costs are driven by the volume of sales. Some of these costs are fixed in the short term, but in the long term, all costs are variable. The important question is why fixed costs are incurred. Running a lemonade stand, for example, requires some lemon, sugar, and water, which vary directly with how much you sell. You also need a table, a tablecloth, a sign, glasses, and a pitcher. Once you buy those items, their costs are fixed in the short run. The price of a glass of lemonade must cover both variable and fixed costs. Businesses are constantly adjusting supposedly fixed costs to reflect demand. Now, this is a true story. Alex Scott started selling lemonade outside of her home to support research on childhood cancer. That effort has grown into a $25 million a year charitable enterprise with many tables, many pitchers, and several employees. As sales rose, the nominally fixed costs rose. Most utilities consider capital investments and most operating costs to be fixed. That is mostly true over a day or a year, but the costs also vary with energy output and consumption. The kinds of power plants the utility built or contracted for was driven by the amount of energy needed from the plants. A cheap peaker for a few hours a year, an expensive nuclear plant for baseload. Generation is often sited far from load to take advantage of low-cost energy like hydro or mine-mouth coal. The transmission added to connect that generation is a result of energy demand, not peak load. For both transmission and distribution, peak and other loads contribute to line losses and equipment deterioration, determining the number and diameter of conductors and the size of transformers needed. The cost of maintaining power plants also vary with usage, just as the cost of maintaining your car varies with miles driven. In the same way, the rate at which T&D equipment degrades is determined by the number of repeated high loads. The fact that these costs are fixed in the short term is irrelevant to their underlying cost causation. To illustrate this fixed versus variable cost issue, consider the many ways to serve an increase in peak demand. A traditional peaker and associated T&D would be a mix of fixed and variable costs. Batteries are almost entirely fixed costs. Demand response to hourly energy price signals incurs almost exclusively variable costs. These three options with different accounting costs perform the same benefits regardless of the cost structure. The manual focuses on the consistent allocation of costs. There are a range of fairly simple reforms that can be used for embedded cost of service studies without too much effort. First, energy is an important cause of a wider range of costs than typically recognized in cost studies. Energy cost per kilowatt hour is not the same in all hours. Many hours contribute to what are usually considered demand costs, not just the 1, 4, or 12 hours often used. The number of customers does not drive the cost of the distribution system, other than the equipment dedicated to a single customer. Some costs of equipment physically located on the distribution system, such as advanced metering and distributed energy, benefit the generation and transmission system as well. Many problems with current embedded cost studies arise from the traditional classification of cost to buckets called demand and energy. Demand typically refers to peak loads. Most traditional demand allocators use loads in very few of the relevant hours and sometimes entirely the wrong hours. Traditional energy allocators usually weight energy usage in all of the years equally, in all hours of the year equally. Energy classified costs actually vary widely with time. So time-based cost allocation can address both of these problems and simplify the classification process. And now Jim will discuss some more cutting-edge reforms for embedded cost of service studies.
Thanks, Paul. First, customer classes really need to reflect the voltage differences or customer type pretty accurately. Second, we have a lot of new functions, including smart grid and energy efficiency, and we have more ability to manage granular data. Most costs can be assigned to time periods. The former divisions between demand and energy are less relevant today as specific resources are used for specific hours. At the distribution level, shared plant to deliver power across a service territory is distinct from customer connection plant and should be treated differently. The customer connection plant can include service drops, secondary lines, and for some customers, dedicated line transformers. A modern embedded cost study can be presented in a manner similar to an older study, but there's an important difference. Where costs were previously classified as demand-related or energy-related, a modern study will assign these costs to specific time periods, such as peak hours, intermediate hours, or all hours. A few site infrastructure, billing, and collection costs are associated with services to each specific customer. Let's look at some specifics for three different functions, starting with generation. Old studies would classify all generation fixed costs as demand related and typically allocate all of these on the highest monthly peaks or sometimes even a single peak hour of the year for all system load. Modern methods will combine the fixed and variable costs and assign them to the hours when each type of generation provides service. The cost will not be equal in every hour. Turning to transmission, the old way was often to classify all costs as demand related and allocate them based on a single metric of peak demand. Modern methods will analyze each major transmission asset individually. The costs will be allocated based on how the segment is used. Finally, distribution. Older methods of allocation would classify many shared system costs as customer related. They would allocate the remaining distribution costs on some metric of non-coincident peak demand. Modern methods only treat the customer-specific costs as customer-related. All shared costs are allocated on some metrics of usage. And peak should be measured over the broad periods of time that actually determine component sizing, not just an hour or two here and there. Now I'll hand it back to Mark to discuss how to present and use results.
Thanks, Jim. The results of an embedded cost of service study are often presented in a complex table like this one. You often start off with how much revenue is currently being collected from each rate class. These tables also present the bottom line for a utility in different ways. That can be shown as the rate of return collected from each class, the profit margin, which is a typical metric for unregulated industries, or the revenue cost ratio. None of these are perfect. Then you can compare that to how much revenue you should be collecting from each class according to the analysis, including the revenue shortfall or surplus for each class. However, we can come up with some more intuitive ways to show the results of cost of service studies. This is a Sankey chart and visually shows how the revenue requirement, up at the top, flows into functions like generation and transmission, then into time periods, and finally to the various customer classes. At each level, the costs add up to the revenue requirement of $1,500, but you can see how, at each step, the process splits up the costs to get the final result. How we use the results of studies is important. These studies are not perfect representations of cost responsibility. Many regulators will use multiple studies to define a range of reasonableness for cost apportionment. Within that range, regulators must apply judgment. Most regulators move gradually in both cost allocation and in rate design to avoid severe impacts on customer classes as allocations change over time. In other words, regulators should think pretty hard about it, and they generally do. The relationship between cost allocation and rate design is not clear and direct. Both cost allocation and rate design include collecting the right amount of revenue as important objectives. But cost allocation is primarily about equity between classes. Rate design is primarily about efficiency and customer understanding. In the past, bad allocation methods have sometimes been used to justify bad rate design. Conversely, good cost allocation techniques can be used to support good rate design, but we cannot be certain that this will happen. I'll give one example of this, where most costs are assigned to the hours when the underlying assets provide service. We start by identifying categories of plant and expenses by function and identifying whether these are serving all hours or are intermediate or peak related. We then assign these costs to time periods. The baseload resources and the transmission and distribution backbone, the stuff that is used continuously to provide service at all hours, are assigned to all hours, here producing a rate of 8 cents. The cost of augmenting the generation, transmission, and distribution system for the mid-peak periods is broadly assigned to the day and early evening hours, here producing a rate of 14 cents. Peaking generation and augmenting the distribution system for higher peak loads is assigned to peak hours, a rate of 22 cents. And some resources like demand response, used for the most extreme hours, are assigned to the specific critical peak hours. Something like 75 cents is a typical critical peak rate. This produces a rate design for the shared elements of the system, tracking costs. This is only one example of the possible transition from costs to rates. There are others, and none are perfect. Thank you for sticking with us to the end of the presentation. We will take questions from now until the close at 3 p.m. Eastern. At that point, we will have a few closing remarks, but Jim, Paul, and I will stay on the line to answer questions for an extra half an hour. You can submit your questions through the questions pane. We'll be starting with some questions submitted in advance. To begin, Paul, one of the questions we got from a registrant was, because system load shapes are changing significantly due to distributed generation, is the role of the demand charge changing?
Well, thanks, Mark. That's strictly speaking a rate design question, which we dealt with in a report that you and I co-authored. A link should be popping up on the chat box. It's charge without a cause, which goes through why demand charges don't do a good job of reflecting cost causation. And one of the points of the cost of service manual is also that non-coincident peak load measures are not good proxies for cost causation. And those demand charges are particularly inappropriate and counterproductive for some of the new technologies, including electric vehicles, storage, and solar.
Thanks, Paul. We have a couple related questions on those points. How do we encourage distributed clean power generation in EV charging facilities? How should we quantify avoided costs for distributed generation? And what is the relationship between system planning and cost allocation, especially as it pertains to distributed generation?
This is Paul again. In terms of encouraging distributed clean power through the cost allocation methodology, the first thing you can do is not burden those customers with costs that they did not incur for equipment and services that they don't use. in particular, looking at the effect on coincident loads in all the relevant hours, rather than just the customer's non-coincident peak demand or the customer's contribution to some particular high load hour, gives you a much better allocation of the cost, and one that rewards the contribution of these new technologies to reducing costs. And yeah, go on.
No, I was going to ask Jim if he has any comments on the EV charging facilities.
I do. EV chargers draw a lot of power for a few hours, and you can control when those hours are. If costs are assigned to the hours when they're incurred, when they provide service, the off-peak hours will have low-cost resources providing service then, perhaps sun in the middle of the day or wind in the middle of the night. And people with electric vehicles can take advantage of that if the cost allocation is to time periods, and then the rate design takes those time periods into some account. In some areas, wind power is an afternoon peaking resource. New Mexico is an example of this. In others, wind power is an evening peaking resource. So the answer will be different in different regions, but if in both cases we assign the costs and the benefits to the appropriate periods, we can create information in the cost allocation process that the rate design process can then look at and set rates so that customers, such as electric vehicle customers, will have an incentive to charge in low-cost periods. This becomes particularly important for high-voltage DC charging stations, the fast charging stations, which are typically have very low utilization across the year. But if the costs are accurately conveyed and the prices reflect those time periods, customers, EV drivers, can learn when it will be cheap to stop in for a charge and when it will be expensive. And we can dramatically reduce the ultimate cost of providing that service. So the whole principle of assigning costs to time periods is key to enabling things like electric vehicles or ice storage, air conditioning, or smart water heaters to be able to take advantage of low-cost power when it's available.
Thanks, Jim. Moving on to the next question. In a recent utility grid modernization proposal, 97% of the benefits were projected for C&I customers, but 48% of the costs were allocated to residential customers. Is that fair?
This Paul again. That's a perfect example of the central problem that we address in the manual. That if you slavishly follow some arbitrary allocation rules, you're going to wind up allocating costs to classes that don't cause them. In this case, the grid mod is caused by the desire to provide benefits to the C&I class, and the costs should be recovered largely from those customers. And we've dealt with many of the reasons that cost of service studies produce these kinds of skewed allocations, such as the assumption that if it's fixed, it has to be demand related, and if it's on the distribution system, it has to be allocated to distribution customers.
Yeah, we have a section in the manual that specifically addresses advanced metering and smart grid costs in Chapter 11.
Thanks, Jim. The next question is, how should costs be allocated on a multi-purpose infrastructure project being shared by regulated and unregulated entities?
Wow. That's a tough question. The manual does not deal a lot with jurisdictional cost allocation. State regulators usually don't deal too much with it. Many of them do, however, have to separate costs between the gas and electric functions of combination utilities or the regulated and unregulated activities of utilities. I can imagine this happening, for example, where a demand response program is put in place across a balancing area that includes multiple utilities, say a large investor-owned utility and several municipal and co-op utilities. And the water heater control network or the air conditioning cycling system needs to operate system-wide. And clearly the stuff installed on the individual systems would get allocated to those systems, but the control system itself, once again, needs to follow not where the costs are incurred, probably all on the system of the large control area operator, but where the benefits occur in terms of cost savings, which we hope would be to all of the regulated and unregulated utilities that are a part of that network. I guess the other way I could interpret the question is infrastructure projects at a company that has both regulated and non-regulated operations. And that's something that utility regulators are pretty familiar with, is dividing those up. I think probably most utilities have some unregulated operations, and the regulators are used to allocating the corporate headquarters office building between the regulated utility operations and the other operations of the company.
Thanks, Jim. So we've gotten a whole bunch of questions on a set of topics that I think are related. At the highest level, will cross subsidies be lessened or mitigated? Do you recommend creating new rate classes? And then more specifically, how do you deal with low-income customers and disruptive technology? Should there be separate rate classes for DERs and solar? I have some thoughts on that, but Jim and Paul, do you want to take any of those?
The customer class one, that's one that I've thought about a lot. I don't think that one should create separate subclasses unless there's a lot of customers in the subclass and they have very distinct usage characteristics. For example, within residential, it probably does make sense to break residential into single-family customers, which have relatively high distribution costs per household, and apartments, multifamily customers who have fewer. And the state of Nevada is an example of a state that has a separate multifamily class. And in Nevada, the customer charge is about 10% lower, and the per kilowatt hour charge is about 8% lower, because both the customer connection costs in the customer charge and the shared distribution costs in the energy charge are lower for apartments. Some utilities have proposed putting solar customers into a separate class, and if you're Hawaii and 18% of your customers are solar, that may make sense. But if you're a typical state in the US with less than 2% of your customers solar, that's probably not large enough. There are ways to address some of the same issues in rate design. In Hawaii, for example, if the solar customers were all put on the time of use rate that exists there, which is not the result of a cost allocation study, it's a pilot time of use rate, then they would be selling power to the system in the middle of the day, which happens to be the cheapest period in Hawaii. They would be buying power from the system in the evening when power is more expensive. And they would wind up just on the same rate as anybody else. They would wind up with a fairly hefty bill at the end of the month, basically paying the system to store power that they produce during the day and take it back at night. So there may be parts of this where there's relatively small numbers of customers that the rate design area is, and time allocation of costs can produce a reasonable result without having to have another subclass with too few customers in it to be meaningful in the cost allocation study. Paul, maybe you have some thoughts on this.
I think you handled that one pretty well. I think there was also a question about whether cross subsidies would be lessened or mitigated. And my response to that is, well, in order to lessen or mitigate cross subsidies, you have to start by understanding what kinds of subsidies or unfair allocations exist currently. And so you need a good cost of service analysis to do that. A heritage, vintage cost study may show that one class is being heavily subsidized by another class, but when you take out some of the inappropriate allocations, it may reverse the relative costing. So once you know what a fair allocation is, then you can move forward with trying to root out cross subsidies.
Yeah, the notion of vintaging, Paul, raises an interesting little bit of history for me. In the early part of my career, new resources were dramatically more expensive than existing resources. And the city of Seattle had a booming commercial sector and a stagnant industrial sector and a stable residential sector. And they were incurring a lot of costs to upgrade their generation, transmission, and distribution system to serve the booming commercial sector. And that was driving the revenue requirement up faster than the sales were going up because new stuff was more expensive than their existing system. And they made a decision to use an allocation method that they called an incremental cost approach, where each class was allocated the costs of growth that were incurred to serve growth in each class, and that resulted in the smallest rate increases for the industrial customers and largest increases for the commercial customers. It wasn't a customer class definition issue. Commercial was still commercial, but it was a vintaging of load approach. It was, and we talk in the manual about some of the hybrid and alternative allocation methods that have been used. They're not common, but they may be appropriate in some locations where some classes growing very much faster than others and causing either costs or benefits that should be recognized.
Thanks, Jim. So we've gotten several questions on AMI, and I'll lump those into two sub-questions. Do we need it to get the relevant data? And is there an objective way to split the costs between energy, demand, and customer?
It's a great way of getting the relevant data. And I've worked with a number of utilities that have stupendous data from their AMI systems, and it's showing things that are very different from what we got from load sampling in the past. And one thing it showed is that specific areas of the service territory that have high, for example, air conditioning saturation, are imposing peak loads that are at different times and different magnitudes than other parts of the service territory that may have less in the way of central air conditioning. And that can be the inland versus coastal areas in California. It can be low income versus suburban service territories for some other utilities. We don't absolutely need it. We can borrow proxy data from nearby utilities. We used to do that in the load sampling era all the time. A large investor-owned utility would do a load research study, and all of the little municipals that were within its control area or nearby would look at that load research as the basis of their own cost allocation studies. And we can still borrow data. I think this question will be moot in 10 or 15 years because nobody's installing dumb meters today. And I think within 10 or 15 years, everybody will be collecting very granular data. But in the meantime, borrowing data is a good tool, and utility regulators need to make sure that that data is available for people to use. The Illinois Commission has probably been the leader in this, requiring that all of the smart meter data that their utilities collect is publicly available for research. You don't know what address it is. They anonymize it within, I think, zip +4. So you've got a couple of dozen customers in each little data group, but you can figure out which are the urban apartment areas and which are the suburban single family areas, or which are the coastal areas or the inland areas within that zip +4 data. So you don't have any specific data on who's taking a shower when, but you do for a group of customers that are commonly located have data, and you can match that up with income data or housing data to produce good results. And if the regulators make sure that all that AMI data is publicly available for research, then adjacent utilities can gain access to it, and the public investment that's being made to the bill payers who are paying for it are producing more value from what they're paying for.
Thanks, Jim. I will offer an answer on the second part of the question that somebody asked. While there's probably not an indisputable way to split the cost of AMI, one thing you can do is allocate it in proportion to the benefits of AMI. If you're saving on meter reading, you allocate part of the cost to meter reading, and if you're saving on peak demand or energy losses, then you allocate it in the relevant proportions of those three benefits. So that offers one principle for splitting up the costs.
Yeah, where many of the benefits are power supply related, to reduce line losses, to enable phase balancing that reduces capacity needs on the distribution system. Allocating it how the shared costs upstream of the meter are being allocated is a way to ensure that the costs follows benefits. The one thing for sure that is not appropriate is to allocate all of those costs on a per customer basis. The example we had earlier of 97% of the benefits going to the non-residential class and 40-some% of the cost being allocated to the residential class obviously fails a cost follows benefits principle.
And it's useful to understand what the AMI is being used for or is expected to be used for. And for example, if a large part of the benefits are expected to be in terms of reducing peaking generation requirements by encouraging load shifting out of critical peak hours, that's a generation level cost that benefits everybody who uses generation.
Here's an odd example. City of Burbank, California was an early smart grid pioneer, one of the largest grant receivers per capita in the Recovery Act in 2009. And the system they installed had a fiber optic ring through the service territory for data delivery to the central computer center, and a Wi-Fi mesh to reach from the meters to the fiber optic ring, and then smart meters at the house. When they got the system installed and up and running, they found that they could read all the meters in the entire city in about 9 minutes a month. So the first thing they did was read everybody's meter in the middle of the night on the first day of the month for the previous calendar month. They got rid of billing cycles. They reduced their postage costs because they were mailing bills all at once. But then they said, we've got this Wi-Fi mesh that's not being used nearly, but 9 minutes a month. What can we do with it? And they opened it up to free citywide Wi-Fi. And you could go to free Burbank Wi-Fi if you're in Burbank, California, and you get a relatively slow connection to the grid, but it's completely eliminated the digital divide in Burbank. Every low-income kid in the schools, if they have a $30 tablet, can connect to the internet wherever they are in the city and do their homework. Well, there's no traditional utility cost allocation principle that we can use to recognize that set of benefits. This is where judgment comes in. That Wi-Fi mesh is providing an unrelated set of benefits that are incredibly valuable. Where does that belong in the cost allocation study? There's no easy answer.
Thanks, Jim. So the next question is, how should we define distribution peak hours for peak-related distribution cost allocation? I think Paul has some thoughts on that.
Yeah, what you want to do basically is to allocate the distribution costs in proportion to the class contributions to the hours that are driving those costs. For example, take a very simple kind of application. You could allocate substation costs in proportion to the class contributions in the hours in which the substations peak. So if 10% of the substations by capacity peak at noon, you might allocate 10% of station costs on load at noon on the peak days, for example. Now, you usually want to charge the same time of use periods for the whole class, rather than getting into people in one neighborhood having a rate that whose peak hours end at 6 p.m. and another one whose peak hours go until 9 p.m. That's going to be a really confusing rate design to communicate. So for rate design, you often have to aggregate. But for cost of service purposes, you can look at how each substation and each feeder is peaking and use that information. Jim, you want to say something?
Yeah, one of the things that drives the sizing of components, transformers in particular, and distribution circuits to a lesser extent, is how many hours the high loads occur for. A transformer can handle like a 250% overload for an hour or two. It does heat up and it does tend to reduce the transformer life, but if your expected peak load duration at a location is of a relatively short duration, you might tolerate that overload rather than install a bigger transformer. And a good example of that might be stadium lighting at a high school that's only on for a couple hours a week. On the other hand, if the load is going to be high and steady for many hours, an office building during the day, for example, or a retail store, you can't use the overload capacity of the transformer because it's going to stay hot for a very long time. You're going to have to install a bigger transformer. And so it's important to use multiple hours, multiple consecutive hours in allocating costs, because we're already doing that in deciding what size transformer to install. We need to apply the same logic in allocating costs as we do when we make the decision of what to install. And the manual talks about the issue of distribution component sizing in chapter 11. And I really urge people to look at that in thinking about distribution allocation.
Thanks, Jim. Another category of questions we got that's related is whether any jurisdictions are using our recommendations and whether we've gotten a receptive audience from commissioners or NARUC. I do have the short answer to that I think Jim and Paul can elaborate on, is that almost all of our recommendations come from at least one jurisdiction. In some cases, some of the more cutting edge recommendations on marginal costs come from telecommunications examples. But we generally, there's at least one jurisdiction that does uses a technique that we really like. For example, the base intermediate peak technique for generation is strongly linked to what a time-based allocation. So Paul and Jim, do you have more thoughts on that?
I think Jim can speak to the kind of reception we've gotten.
Yeah, there's two parts to it. Obviously, it took us a couple of years to put this manual together, and in that time, RAP was working with regulators all around the country. And California has made changes in their non-residential rate design to reflect some of the principles on trying to move to a multi-hour measurement that we've talked about. Minnesota has made some changes that are consistent with what we're discussing. I think Paul mentioned, might have mentioned earlier, that the Colorado Commission just recently ordered the Black Hills Power and Light required them to use the basic customer method and to discontinue using the minimum system method. So there's movement happening. We learned almost everything in the manual and things that people are doing. The manual is filled with citations to commission decisions, and you can follow those case citations. But I think most regulators are really just beginning to realize that wind and solar and storage and demand response really require some new methods, and we hope that the manual meets their needs.
Thanks, Jim. It's nearly 3 p.m. and it's time to wrap up the formal part of the webinar. Jim now will discuss some of our important takeaways. We will stay on for another 30 minutes to take more questions.
Thanks, Mark. There's a lot of important concepts and takeaways in the 270 or so pages of the manual. I'll try and boil that down to just a couple of slides. We touched on some of the more specific recommendations earlier. First, consider both cost causation, that is why things were built, and also current benefits, how they are used today. There have been changes. Second, be aware of and incorporate both technology and regulatory changes in the methods you use. Use the data that's available for smart meters. And as I mentioned earlier, even if you have to borrow data from a neighbor utility that's ahead of you on deployment. And finally, recognize that smart grid investments on the distribution system often provide upstream benefits for generation and transmission, and take those benefits into account in cost allocation. So here are some of the most broadly applicable specific reforms. First, customer class definition. My favorite, I mentioned, is to separate single family and multifamily customers, as Nevada has done. Use time-based methods to apportion generation, transmission, and all shared distribution costs. Make clear that what the distinction is between shared assets that multiple customers use and customer-specific assets. The shared assets are not customer-related. Recognize that administrative and general costs support all parts of the system. 3/4 of a century ago, the Supreme Court said that allocation of costs has no claim to an exact science. Despite better data, more powerful computers, and much smarter regulators, that remains true today. Quality analysis is important. Good judgment is critical. thank you for joining us. As Mark indicated, the three of us will stay on for another half hour to address more of your questions until we've lost a critical mass of audience. Mark?
Thanks, Jim. So the next set of questions is two questions that point in the opposite direction, I think. One person asked, how do we make the timing of rates predictable in a changing landscape if things are shifting quickly over time? And then the second is whether the cost of generation are evening out across the hours of the day, and whether that lessens the importance of time of use rates.
I would start with the second question and say that's certainly something I haven't seen. I mean, the fact that we've gone from having high oil and gas based costs in some hours and low coal based marginal costs in other hours to having mostly gas and some coal, depending upon what system you're looking at. But the gas prices are low, so the difference between an efficient and inefficient gas price isn't what it used to be, and the difference between gas and coal prices isn't what it used to be. In fact, gas is often cheaper, but that's a result of a specific set of short-term fuel prices. And other things are going on as well. For example, California in particular has a very low morning and midday net loads, especially in the spring and summer, as solar generation behind the meter and central pushes down the amount of generation that's required from other sources. So there can be some very wide swings in costs even though they're different than they used to be. And the first question about how you deal with the fact that things are changing, that maybe you're going from a midday peak to an evening peak and a very low morning net load as solar comes online, or perhaps a different kind of shape as your wind penetration rises. To deal with that, you might want to look at the costs, both for cost of service and for rate design, using expected load shapes over the next several years, at least for the years in which you expect the rates to be in effect.
One thing I want to caution people is, as I looked at the question and referring to an article that I'd seen, the system lambda costs may be evening out, and in fact in Hawaii they're going to ultimately, and other places, they ultimately will be basically zero once you have 100% wind and solar and storage system. You have no variable costs, so the dispatch costs at any hour will quite possibly be zero or near zero. And certainly in the Western U.S., where we have a dramatic surplus of gas-fired generation, prices very seldom go above the cost of dispatching gas-fired generation. But the question always has to be, look at all of the costs that are required to provide service in a time period, not just the short-run variable costs. And Manual is very clear on the need to sort of eliminate the fixed cost, variable cost distinction. If a utility builds a wind farm, it's a fixed cost. If they buy the output of a wind farm on a purchase power agreement, it's a variable cost. It's the same cost doing the same thing, the same hours, and the cost should be allocated at the same time. In either case, the true variable cost is going to be zero, and the true opportunity cost is going to be the cost of building and operating a wind farm. And so I don't think TOU rates are at all becoming outdated because generation is evening out across hours of the day, if one looks at it from a what hours are is wind and solar running sort of as it flows, and what hours does it require storage? What hours are we building storage for or building peakers for? What hours are we upsizing the transmission and distribution system for? What segments of the transmission system are we upgrading in order to bring wind power into the system that may be coming at a off-peak period versus the segments that we're building to bring other resources into the system that may be during on-peak hours? All those kinds of questions are part of what the manual focuses on, is apportioning costs to the time periods when they're used. And I think that produces a very different result than a market clearing price or system lambda does.
Thanks, Jim. Another question. What is the link between cost allocation and incentive-based pricing or performance-based regulation? Touched on it a little bit earlier, but I think there's more.
We did touch on it a little bit. Performance-based regulation in particular moves the utilities' earnings opportunities away from things that they own and into things that they do. There's definitely going to be an important cost allocation challenge for analysts as to how do we apportion the incentive payments or the penalties into the cost buckets, historically demand and energy and customer, but I think increasingly time-based, that flow through ultimately to the customer classes and from there to rates. And that's not an easy question. It's going to require a lot of informed judgment for analysts. Paul?
Yeah, one other thing that to remain aware of is if your incentive rate making is in the form of a bonus return on equity, for example, that you shouldn't just be spreading that across all investments. If you're getting, if the utility's getting a bonus based upon their having improved the reliability of the distribution system, that's sort of a cost of getting a good distribution system, and it ought to be allocated accordingly. And in the same way, if they're getting a bonus for reducing their carbon emissions, that should be allocated as a generation energy cost, not just going to everything that they have in the rate base, including things like meters that had nothing to do with the incentive and were not part of the cost of one of the drivers of the cost.
Chapter 7 of the manual has whole little subsections on restructuring, holding companies, performance-based regulation issues, trackers and riders, public policy programs, and you know, we've given a fair amount of thought to that, but there are not many examples of regulators making specific decisions on cost allocation issues related to these that we were able to rely on. So we've raised the issues and discussed some principles, but I think the next 20 years will give us a lot more information about how regulators have found it's equitable to do these to take on these challenges.
Thanks, Jim. Another set of cutting-edge questions on EV charging and charging stations. Who should pay for it? How is that different for residential, workplace, and public stations? And then conversely, how should you think about compensation rates for electric school buses if they discharge during peak demand hours?
Well, let me take the school bus one first. Electric school buses are a phenomenal opportunity. They're much more exciting to me from a system management perspective than transit buses. Transit buses go, 200 miles a day, and in order to run them all day on a battery that you charge overnight, you need a monstrous battery and a fabulously expensive bus and a substation level, at the charging center. School buses travel about 50 miles a day. They need much smaller batteries. They run many fewer hours. They're mostly idle in the middle of the day. In solar-rich areas, they can charge on solar. They do almost nothing in the summer months. They're available. Those batteries could be available to the grid as a source of peaking capacity. One study that Vermont Energy Efficiency Corporation did showed that the school bus fleet of Massachusetts, if operated in a vehicle to grid configuration, could provide 960 megawatts of peaking capacity to the New England grid. And the challenge is to make it cheap enough for the school district to install the charging system that they need and encourage them to put it where it's best to put it. Should the school buses be charged at the schools, where they spend from 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. doing nothing in the heart of the solar day, and the school probably has a fairly healthy grid connection, and if it's surrounded by houses that have lots of solar, you're going to have generation, transmission, and distribution savings by charging it at the school. But on a traditional non-coincident demand cost allocation and rate design basis, on a cloud, that might drive up dramatically the allocation of costs to the school. Should they be relocated to a existing transmission substation that's not too far away, where there's lots of capacity available, and put the charging equipment there? Or should we install the charging equipment back at the bus barn, where they typically go back to between 9 and 2? If we make it economical for the school system or the school bus operator to put them where it's cheapest for the system, maybe they'll do that. If we make them pay for capacity in one location when the school buses are charging and capacity in another location where the schools are, if in fact that capacity can be shared, then we're making it hard for them to choose the electric bus alternative. If we're in a system where they should be charged overnight, clearly they can share capacity with the school that only operates during the day. Even though they might be in different locations on different meters, we should let them totalize those meters so that they're not paying for generation and transmission capacity twice. And the cost allocation mechanism, by assigning costs to time periods, not to demand and energy, enables us to do that. Daytime costs would be paid by the school, nighttime costs would be paid at the bus barn, and the shared capacity costs would be split between those two set of users. For residential EVs, it's quite a different thing. I have an EV. If there's 6 houses on my street that are connected to a single transformer, if 3 people were charging electric vehicles at the same time, it would use up all of the capacity of that transformer. Smart chargers are the answer, making sure that we don't have too many people charging all at once. And the Minnesota pilot of the utility providing the smart chargers is enabling the utility to control those chargers so that the customer gets a charge when power is cheap, but also is controlled to make sure that they're not overloading the local transformer or circuit when they're charging. In that sense, there's a real advantage to having the utility have an investment in that charging system, because it helps they can minimize system costs that way. Or at least have a smart enough cost allocation and rate design, the customer has an incentive to subscribe to some other non-utility service to manage the charging. It's in every case, it's a matter of making sure that the cost information is accurately assembled, accurately apportioned, and accurately conveyed.
Right. Jim, can I just take that up sort of a level conceptually and say, in doing the cost allocation, you should start with the question of why are we installing these EV chargers in the first place? Why are we promoting EVs? Why are we incurring these costs? And if the answer is, well, it's just a customer service, it's something that these particular customers want to have because it attracts some of their customers. That's one thing. But I think in most cases you'll find that the real reason the utility is involved in EVs and that the state is pushing them in that direction is that there's a mandate, an interest, a concern about reducing carbon emissions and pollution. And so it's partly to solve a transportation related issue, but also to solve a big problem for the electric generation grid, which is that we have to bring down our aggregate carbon emissions. And so a large part of the benefits may very well be related to reduce carbon emissions and reducing the pressure on the electric system to clean up its act to keep the state within its trajectory for reductions. So maybe simple energy. As Jim said, there may be the benefits of switching generation requirements from one time period to another to reduce costs, both variable costs and the fixed costs of providing additional capacity to provide generation in high load periods, and also to reduce T&D costs. So you look at the justification documents for the EV process and try and work from there to why are we doing this? What are the benefits? What's driving the decision to get the utility involved? And then go from there to the functionalization classification of the.
Yeah, I think Paul's hit on something that is a theme throughout the manual, which is always ask why. Why are these costs being incurred? Why is this technology being chosen? Why are we installing it where we're installing it? And what costs would we otherwise incur if we didn't do this least cost thing? As more and more states are requiring not just integrated resource planning on the generation side, but also integrated distribution planning for distribution systems, we're finding that storage and demand response is being pushed out near or beyond the customer meter. And whether it's for electric vehicles or air conditioners or water heaters or other smart appliances, we're doing this all to minimize total system cost and production, generation, transmission, and distribution. And the cost of these systems needs to be assigned in the same way that the more expensive alternative costs of building peakers and more transmission capacity and more distribution capacity would be assigned.
Yeah, it sort of goes back to a question that was asked very early in the questions session, which was, what's the relationship between system planning and cost allocation? And the answer is that cost allocation should really reflect a realistic view of system planning. And that goes for generation and transmission and distribution and wherever it is that you're installing AMI and smart grid technologies and electric vehicle chargers. If you apply some arbitrary rules about it's on the distribution system, so it's a distribution cost, it's a fixed investment, therefore it has to be a demand related cost, you're going to get the wrong answer. And if you, as Jim said, start with the question, why are we doing this? What's it for? Why are we doing this instead of something cheaper? Then you'll more often lead yourself to the right answer, or at least a reasonable answer. Perhaps saying right.
I don't think Burbank anticipated all of the benefits they're getting from their smart grid investment, but there was no rate increase for smart grid in Burbank because the first thing they did with the system was to run a program called Smart Saver to right size every transformer on the system and then to do phase balancing on the system. And their line loss reductions alone produced enough power supply cost savings to make their entire payment on the bonds that they issued to pay for the smart grid system. And they didn't even thought about city-wide Wi-Fi as a benefit. Customers don't pay anything separate for it. It's just part of having a municipal electric utility. It's clearly valuable to people all over the city.
Thanks, guys. So we have about 10 minutes left if there are any more questions. We do have another question about larger scale storage, pumped hydro and gravity storage. I suppose there are a few other technologies that go under that heading too. How should we think about those?
Well, the most important two things that occur to me about storage is that distributed storage can provide transmission and distribution benefits, and centralized storage provides less of those benefits. And we need to consider which is the most appropriate type of storage, considering all of the costs. If we build centralized storage, then we need to continue to have the distribution capacity to get it there. And that's true whether it's gravity storage, which can probably be done in any industrial area, or pump storage hydro, which can only be done somewhere where there's a appropriate site that may be some distance from the service territory, or existing dam reservoir management, which are hydro projects that may be hundreds of miles from the service territory and have dedicated transmission lines. But we can manage those hydro projects to maximize the value of the limited amount of water that's there. We have to look at all the benefits of the storage. Provides energy arbitrage, that is being able to buy power when it's cheap and use it when it's more valuable. If it's distributed, it provides transmission and distribution cost savings. Traditionally, a lot of those were classified as demand related, but today we would simply assign them to the high load hours. It can provide customer reliability. Green Mountain Power's program with Tesla batteries puts them in the customer's house. The utility uses them for energy arbitrage and for transmission and distribution cost reduction and for ancillary services. But when there's a power outage, the customer has the benefit of the battery for reliability. And they split the cost between the utility and the customer, with the utility paying for and receiving the utility system benefits and the customer paying for and receiving the reliability benefits. And at that program maybe has some lessons for us. The manual has a couple of chapters that deal with storage. Chapter 7 has a section 7.1 that talks about storage, and then in the cutting edge approaches in chapter 25 we talk a little bit about the role of storage. It's go ahead.
I think we can agree that whatever kind of storage you have, and why ever you installed it, it wasn't to meet 1 hour load every year or even 1 hour a month. That it's the reason that you went that way as opposed to some less expensive peaking resource was to because you're going to use it many hours and with a lot of flexibility to shift energy around. And whatever your allocator is, it has to reflect that.
Yeah, most of the wind and solar facilities that are being built today in the U.S. are being built with typically 4 hours of storage. That 4 hours of storage means it can store 4 hours of the output of the wind or solar project. But that storage can be delivered back into the system at a different rate. Often they install enough inverter capacity that they can deliver it back in a 2 hour period. Or sometimes they'll spread it out and, save it to run it all night and run it at half bell for 8 hours. Why is it being built? Why are we choosing this technology? To what purposes do we expect it to be used? And for what purposes is it actually being used? Are all questions to ask in that cost allocation question, as for every other asset on the system.
Okay, I have one very last closely related follow-up question, I think, actually. If you're installing a battery and solar as a non-wire solution instead of a distribution feeder upgrade, would you allocate that like the distribution upgrade or in some other way?
I certainly wouldn't assign more of its cost to the functions that the distribution upgrade is to cover, but that battery is also going to provide ancillary services, which is a generation function. It's going to provide energy arbitrage. You're going to be able to charge that battery when power is cheap and deliver it in a local area, avoiding not just the higher power supply cost, but transmission costs to get it to the substation and the distribution cost to get it to the customer if it's pushed all the way out onto the primary circuits.
So one way of thinking of it would be look at the benefits you're anticipating from your non-wires alternative, which would include avoiding the wires, but also various other kinds of revenue sources or cost reductions, and then allocate in that proportion. If half the benefits are coming from avoiding distribution costs, maybe half the costs of the project are distribution related, 40% are generation related, and 10% transmission related, or whatever your specific situation is.
Yeah, there's been some very good work on value stacking done by Rocky Mountain Institute and and a couple other organizations, and one can look at that value stacking for storage and see what are the expected benefits, and in deciding to deploy storage, choosing where to put it and how much to put it may be driven by the desire to avoid distribution capacity upgrades, but how much you're going to buy on the total system may be driven more by generation and transmission factors.
All right, that about brings us to our close, everyone. We'll be sending slides around in a few days along with a recording of the webinar. Jim, would you like to go through the key takeaways again to take us out?
Sure. Donna, can you it up? There's a lot of important concepts and takeaways in the manual. We try to boil things down to 90 minutes, but it's going to take you longer than that to read the whole manual. There's some key concepts. First, consider both cost causation, why things were built, and current benefits, how they're used today. Second, be aware of and incorporate both current and projected technology and regulatory changes. Use the data that's available from smart meters, even if you have to borrow data from a neighbor utility, and regulators need to make it easy to do that. Finally, recognize that smart grid investments on the distribution system often provide upstream benefits for generation and transmission. And we've just been talking about that with respect to storage. These are some of the most broadly applicable specific reforms. First, better customer class definition. And we've talked about the notion that customer classes should have a pretty significant number of customers in them, at least for the broad use classes. We should use time-based methods to apportion generation, transmission, and distribution costs. Make clear distinctions between shared assets that get apportioned on a time basis and customer-specific assets on the distribution system. And recognize that A&G costs support all parts of the system. Thanks for joining us, and we hope you download the manual. I'll have Donna maybe pop that link up again. Electric Cost Allocation for a New Era, available for download at raponline.org. And our contact email addresses are here, and you can reach out to any of us.